These are the last known images of Alexandra Morgan captured on camera on the morning of November 14th, 2021 in Cranbrook, Kent. Just a few hours later, she disappeared after driving to Littlebridge Farm. So what happened after that final piece of CCTV footage? Alexandra Morgan, known to most people as Alex, was a 34-year-old single mother living in Cranbrook, Kent. She worked as a dog groomer, a steady job, but not one that made life any less difficult. Most of Alex's time was devoted to her two young sons, and everyone who knew her understood that she was always trying to keep life as normal as possible for them. By November 2021, Alex was still carrying almost everything on her own. So when she told her family she was going away for a few days on a spa break, it did not sound unusual at all. It sounded like something an overwhelmed mother had finally allowed herself after spending so long doing nothing but holding everything together for everyone else. On the evening of November 13th, Alex took her two sons to her parents' house so their grandparents could look after them. She said she would be away for a few days and would come back to pick them up afterward. No one in the family thought it would be the last time everything still felt normal. To them, it was just a short trip before life returned to usual. The next morning, November 14th, 2021, Alex left Cranbrook in her white Mini Cooper. On the way, she stopped at a gas station near her home. Security cameras recorded her getting out of the car, going inside to buy a few things, speaking briefly with an employee, and then driving away. Nothing in that footage warned of what was coming. She did not look panicked, rushed, or in crisis. Everything looked like a completely ordinary morning. That sense of normalcy is what makes this case feel even heavier. Looking back, it was not just a stop along the road. It was the last time Alexandra Morgan was captured on camera while she was still safe. 3 days later, Alex did not come back to pick up her children as promised. Her phone could no longer be reached. Her messages went unanswered. As the silence stretched on, her family realized something was wrong. But on the morning of November 14th, no one yet knew that the trip she had begun was not leading to the place she had claimed. At first, no one had any reason to doubt the story Alex had told her family. She said she was going to a spa in York, which meant heading north. If that had been true, her route that morning should have gone in a completely different direction. But when her family reported her missing and police began retracing her movements using traffic cameras and license plate recognition data, one critical detail quickly emerged. Alex's Mini Cooper had not gone toward York at all. The data showed that her car had traveled south instead. That one detail alone was enough to change the entire direction of the investigation. From that moment on, the question was no longer what had happened to Alex on the way to a spa. The real question became, where had she actually gone, and why had she hidden her true destination from everyone? As investigators kept tracing her route, things became even harder to explain. Alex's car seemed to be moving along quieter roads with fewer cameras. Her phone remained active for a short period, showing that she continued farther into Sussex before abruptly dropping off the network. Then a key piece of footage appeared. Near a scrapyard on a narrow road, Alex's Mini was seen sitting still, as if she were waiting for someone. A few minutes later, a gold Jaguar entered the frame, passed her car, and turned down a smaller lane leading deeper into farmland. Moments later, Alex's Mini started up and followed it. That road led both vehicles to a place called Littlebridge Farm. The name sounded peaceful, but in the case file it became the place where everything began to darken. From the moment the Mini entered that property, the story Alex had told her family completely collapsed. There was no spa in York. There was no weekend getaway as everyone had believed. Instead, there was a secret meeting at an isolated location. That was the first major turning point in the investigation. From the moment the car turned onto the lane leading to Littlebridge Farm, this missing person case began to look like something that had been hidden from the start. After tracing the route to Littlebridge Farm, investigators began assembling the first pieces of the secret meeting Alex had gone to such lengths to conceal. The driver of the gold Jaguar was identified as Mark Brown, a man in his 40s who worked in construction and car repair and appeared to live a fairly ordinary life on the surface. But to Alex, Mark Brown was not a stranger. The data later showed that the two had been in contact for months. Alex knew Brown through adult work, where she used another name to communicate with clients. This was a part of her life her family knew nothing about. Over the course of several months, Brown and Alex had arranged multiple meetings. That explained why, on the morning of November 14th, Alex was not driving to a completely unfamiliar place in a state of maximum caution. But there was more between them than those earlier meetings. According to data recovered later, Brown had also made Alex a major financial offer. He described a short-term job, said it was safe, and promised an amount of money that could completely change her life. For a single mother trying to keep everything from falling apart, that promise looked less like a simple transaction and more like a way out. Alex's online searches later showed that she had been thinking very concretely about the future. She looked up house deposits, taxes, and the possibility of starting her own business. That was not the mindset of someone thinking about quick spending money. It was the mindset of someone trying to imagine how this opportunity could change life for her children. So the meeting on the morning of November 14th came into sharper focus. It was not an impulsive trip. It was a decision driven by hope. Sometimes danger does not begin with a threat. Sometimes it begins with familiarity, with a promise that sounds believable, and with the hope that this time things really might be different. When police first arrived at Little Bridge Farm, they still did not know exactly what had happened to Alex. All they knew was that her car had entered the property on the morning of November 14th, and from there, her trail abruptly broke off. While the search was still producing no clear answer, Mark Brown appeared at the property himself. Brown admitted that Alex had come to see him that morning. He said everything had gone normally and that Alex had left about 45 minutes after arriving. If that explanation had been true, the investigation would have had to expand away from the farm. But the problem was that Brown's version of events did not hold up for long. When investigators went back and reviewed the camera footage around the area, they found no sign of Alex's Mini Cooper leaving Little Bridge Farm during the time Brown described. The car did not disappear from the property after 45 minutes. Instead, the footage showed it remained there much longer. That was the first contradiction, and it was serious enough to force Brown's entire account back under scrutiny. Then came an even more troubling detail. The Mini did eventually reappear on camera later, but the person behind the wheel was not Alex. In that moment, this was no longer just an inaccurate statement. It became evidence that someone else had taken control of her car after she disappeared. For investigators, that was the true turning point in the case. Up until then, it was still possible that Alex had disappeared for some unknown reason after the meeting. But once the cameras began contradicting the story told by the last person who admitted seeing her, Little Bridge Farm was no longer just a stop along the route. It became the center of the case. What stood out was that Brown did not appear panicked at all. He cooperated just enough, acknowledged what was already too difficult to deny, and at the same time offered a version of events that did not match the objective evidence. In this case, the footage itself broke apart the first story Brown tried to tell. As Mark Brown's explanation began to unravel, the search at Little Bridge Farm immediately took on a different meaning. It was no longer just the last place Alex had been seen entering. It began to look like a space arranged to conceal far more than it did to support ordinary work. The property was filled with clutter, tools, containers, and outbuildings. Most striking was a small space built inside one of the containers, showing signs that someone had once been living there, but with the door locking from the outside. That detail alone raised serious questions. No one at that point could say for certain whether Alex had ever been in that space, but to those processing the scene, it raised an obvious fear. If someone had been kept there, it would have been the kind of place where calling for help might be almost impossible. At the same time, police returned to Alex's house and found even more important clues. A short note led them to a child's roller skating box. Inside, they found cash, another handwritten note, and a separate phone. When police opened that phone, the history of contact between Alex and Brown became much clearer. The meeting at Little Bridge Farm was no longer a vague blank space. It had preparation, it had prior messages, and it showed that Alex had entered that trip in a state of unease, not complete confidence. From the moment those items were found, the story began to change. Alex was not just a woman who secretly met someone and then vanished. She was a mother who had left money behind for her children, left a trail subtle enough that only a careful search would uncover it, and carried with her a part of her life her family had never fully known. The investigation later led to Darren Ripley. He admitted that he had helped Mark Brown move the Mini away from Little Bridge Farm that same night. The car was later found abandoned on a quiet dead-end road with no sign of Alex inside. From there, police expanded the search to the places Brown spent time and worked. At a construction site, they found an old oil drum blackened and warped by extreme heat. Inside were items linked to Alex, followed by small bone fragments, the remains of teeth, and a ring distorted by fire. That was the moment the case moved beyond suspicion. Alex had not simply disappeared, she was dead, and there were clear signs that someone had tried to erase nearly all physical trace of her existence. What made this part especially disturbing was not only the brutality, but the sense of planning behind it. But the oil drum did not only answer questions about Alex. During the search of Brown's van and the items around him, police also found a prescription in the name of Leah Ware. That was the point at which the file began to suggest that before Alex, another woman may already have entered this same orbit and disappeared. Leah Ware did not appear as a side figure. She emerged like a shadow that had passed through Brown's life months before Alex, with fainter traces and less immediate attention, but in a way that made the picture surrounding Little Bridge Farm far more disturbing. From that point on, Little Bridge Farm was no longer just the place Alex had entered and vanished. It became the point where two women's lives and two unanswered absences intersected, with Mark Brown standing in the middle. Once Leah Ware's name entered the file, Alexandra Morgan's case no longer stood alone. Investigators began looking back and realized that another woman had vanished within Mark Brown's orbit, only far more quietly. Leah did not trigger immediate alarm the way Alex did. Because of that, the gap around Leah's disappearance existed longer, dimmer, and nearly slipped fully into silence. But once the scattered pieces were placed side by side, the picture started to emerge. Little Bridge Farm was no longer only the last place Alex was seen entering. It became the point where two stories crossed. Two women, two different circumstances, but both moving through the orbit of the same man, both leaving behind traces that only made full sense once investigators put them together. In the final stage of the investigation, some of the most important material came not from the property itself, but from digital evidence and preserved communication. Messages, phone data, financial activity, and physical evidence gradually closed the gap Brown had tried to keep sealed, not through one full confession, but through a chain of small details, each one incomplete on its own, yet all pointing in the same direction when placed together. According to the record that followed, the case went to trial, and Mark Brown was convicted in connection with both Alexandra Morgan and Leah Ware. Legally, that was the end of the investigation. But for the families of both women, the verdict could not restore what had been taken. And that is what lingers most in this case. Not just a place called Little Bridge Farm, but two lives that passed through it and never returned. In the end, it was the smallest details, a route that did not match the story, a moved car, surviving evidence, phone data, and old messages that told the truth. The case of Alexandra Morgan and Leah Ware shows that sometimes the truth does not emerge from one dramatic moment, but from many small details fitted together. Surveillance footage, phone data, and evidence that might have seemed meaningless in isolation ultimately formed the complete picture. This video is presented for educational and informational purposes only. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.